The knock came like a fist against a coffin lid. Elena froze by the hearth, her needle hanging mid-stitch. Outside, the Yorkshire moor was roaring, wind tearing across the heather, rain hammering the thatch above her head so hard it sounded ready to give way. No one traveled these roads after dark, not in October, not in a storm like this one. The knock came again, harder. She wrapped her father's old shawl tighter around her shoulders and crossed the small stone cottage, her bare feet cold against the floor. When she pulled the door open, the wind nearly tore it from her hand. A man stood there, soaked through to the bone, his greatcoat plastered black with rain and mud. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and even half drowned there was something in the way he held himself, straight-backed, chin lifted, that didn't belong on a moor road at midnight.
"My horse bolted," he said, his voice rough with cold. "I've walked near 2 miles in this. I saw your light."
Elena hesitated. A woman alone did not open her door to strange men, not out here where the nearest neighbor was a mile off and the nearest magistrate further still. But the rain was falling like judgment, and beneath the mud on his face she saw something closer to exhaustion than danger. "Come in then," she said, "before you catch your death on my doorstep." He ducked beneath the low lintel and stepped inside, and the cottage, small as it was, seemed to shrink further around him. Elena busied herself building up the fire while he stood dripping onto her flagstones, glancing about at the modest room, the narrow bed in the corner, the black kettle, the single chair that had been her father's. "You've a kind heart taking in a stranger," he said. "I've a spare blanket and half a loaf. Don't mistake it for more than it is." She nodded toward the chair. "Sit before you fall down." He sat. And despite the mud and the rain-plastered hair, despite the coat that had clearly cost more than everything Elena owned, he thanked her the way a man thanks another man, plainly, without the practiced courtesy of someone used to being served. That, more than anything, struck her as odd. "What do I call you?" she asked, setting a cup of hot broth in his hands. He paused, just a heartbeat too long. "Thomas," he said. She didn't press him on it. Names were a traveler's own business, and she had learned long ago not to ask questions she didn't want lied to. As the fire caught and the room began to warm, Thomas spoke of why he was out on the moor roads so far from anywhere. He was searching, he said, for an old estate that had vanished from the maps decades ago, a manor that had once belonged to a branch of his family before it simply disappeared from every record he could find. No deed, no mention in the county rolls, as though the house and everyone who had lived in it had been quietly erased. "It's a fool's errand, likely," he admitted, staring into the fire. "I've chased rumors through 3 counties and found nothing but old men who remember the name, and nothing else." "What was it called?" "Blackthorn Manor." Elena went still. The broth spoon paused halfway to the pot. Blackthorn. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud since she was a girl, sitting at her grandmother's knee while the old woman spun stories by candlelight. Stories of a grand house swallowed by ivy and silence, of a family that had vanished from the county in disgrace, of a name the older folk still crossed themselves at, though none of them could say quite why. "I know that name," she said slowly. Thomas looked up. Whatever weariness had settled in his face fell away at once, replaced by something sharper, hope, and beneath it, something closer to desperation. "You know it?" "My grandmother spoke of it, said there was a chapel near it, once, and a village that used to serve the house before it all went quiet." She hesitated, watching him. "Why does it matter so much to you? A house that's been empty for decades?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Elena noticed something she hadn't before, a mark on his hand, half hidden beneath his sodden cuff, that looked less like a laborer's callus and more like the pressed indent of a ring he'd removed in haste. She said nothing of it. Not yet. "It matters," Thomas said finally, "because I believe my family was told a lie about it, and I mean to learn the truth before I die not knowing." Elena studied him a long moment, the fine coat gone humble with mud, the voice too careful to belong to any farmer, the strange urgency in his eyes. She thought of the 2 silver coins he'd offered her for a night's shelter and a morning's guidance, more than she'd see in a month of mending. She thought, too, of the storm outside, and how some doors, once opened, were never meant to close again. "I'll take you as far as the old chapel road at first light," she said. "After that, we'll see." Outside, the wind screamed on, but something had already changed inside the little stone cottage. A thread pulled loose that neither of them yet understood would unravel far more than an old family's secret. Before dawn had fully broken over the moor, they set out together.
They left the moor cottage as grey light crept over the hills, the storm spent to nothing but a thin drizzle. Thomas had managed to buy back a horse from a farmer along the road, and Elena rode behind him on a hired mare, her few belongings tied in a cloth bundle against her hip. She had left a note for no one, because there was no one left to leave it for. The first village they reached, Kettlewell, was little more than a scatter of stone cottages and a smithy, but its church was old, and its churchyard older still. Thomas asked after the name Blackthorn with a caution that struck Elena as practiced, as though he had learned long ago how to ask questions without answering any himself. Most doors gave them nothing but blank stares and shaken heads. But in the third village, a coaching stop called Marrick, an old woman selling eggs at her gate paused at the name and crossed herself the way Elena's grandmother used to.
"Blackthorn," the woman muttered. "My mother spoke of it. Said the family there vanished sudden-like, and the house was left to rot rather than be sold. Strange business, that."
"Do you know where it stood?" Thomas asked.
"Further east, I'd wager. Ask at the parish house in Reeth. Old Clerk Whitfield keeps every register back to his grandfather's time. If it's written anywhere, it's written there."
They rode on through farmland stitched with dry stone walls, past shepherds moving their flocks before the coming winter. In the evenings, they stopped at coaching inns, small and smoke-dark, where Thomas always took a modest room and never once let slip the manner of a man used to finer things. Elena noticed it nonetheless, the way he stood when a lady passed, the way he corrected himself mid-sentence when his words came out too refined for a common traveler.
"You speak like a man who's had schooling,"
she said one evening, over a shared plate of bread and mutton.
"A parson taught me my letters," he said. "Nothing more grand than that."
It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and Elena was beginning to sense the shape of what he wasn't saying, even if she couldn't yet name it. In Reeth, Clerk Whitfield proved as good as the egg-seller's word. He was a stooped, ink-stained man who kept his parish records in a room that smelled of dust and tallow candles, and he pulled down register after register until his hands were black at the fingertips. "Blackthorn," he said finally, tapping a page with something like triumph. "Here, a marriage recorded, 1761, and a burial some years after. But look here, the entries simply stop. No births, no deaths, no marriages past 1779, as though the parish itself forgot the family existed." "Is there anything about the house?" Elena asked.
"Only this note, scrawled in the margin by whoever kept the book before me." He squinted at the faded ink. "Chapel removed from consecrated use, family departed under circumstance." No more than that. But there was a chapel, once, that served the estate. If it still stands, it'll be south, toward the Derbyshire border. Thomas thanked him with a coin that made the old clerk's eyes widen, and Elena filed the moment away. Another small crack in the story of a man who claimed to have nothing but a parson's schooling. That night, in the inn's common room, she watched Thomas take out a small leather journal and sketch the shape of the hills they'd passed, the crook of the river, the position of a particular oak that marked the turn toward Reeth. He drew with a careful, trained hand, marking distances in a way no ordinary traveler bothered to. "You could simply use a map," she said, amused. "Maps lie," he said, not looking up. They show what a surveyor decided was worth showing. I'd rather trust what I've seen myself." There was something almost boyish in the way he said it, a flicker of the man beneath the caution, and Elena found herself smiling before she caught herself doing it. They talked more that night than they had since the storm, of her father, a stonemason who died of a fever 2 winters past, of her mother, gone long before that, of the quiet, narrow life she'd built alone in the cottage he'd stumbled into. Thomas listened in a way few men had ever listened to her, without impatience, without the pity she'd grown used to from the village wives. He offered little of himself in return, only that his own family was large, complicated, and not without its share of old grievances he didn't yet understand.
"We're alike in that then," Eleanor said, "neither of us quite knowing our own history."
Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "though I suspect you'll like the truth of yours a great deal more than I'll like mine." Neither of them slept easily that night, though for entirely different reasons. By morning, they were on the road south, toward Derbyshire, and toward the chapel that would change everything they thought they understood about the man calling himself Thomas. The chapel rose out of the hillside like something the earth had tried to swallow and given up on. Elena saw it first, a low, gray shape, half buried in a stand of ancient yew trees, their branches so old and twisted they seemed to hold the building up rather than shade it. No path led to it anymore. They had to leave the horses tethered at the foot of the hill and climb the last stretch on foot, through brambles and wet bracken that soaked them to the knee. "It's Norman," Thomas said, running a hand along the weathered doorway. "Older than anything else we found." The door gave with a groan that echoed strangely inside. Dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed for what looked like years, and pigeons startled from the rafters overhead. But someone had been keeping the place from total ruin. The flagstones were swept, and a single candle stub sat melted onto the altar rail. "Someone tends this," Elena said. "I do." The voice came from the doorway behind them. An old man stood there, bent nearly double with age, dressed in a black coat gone green at the seams. He introduced himself as Mr. Anselm, vicar of the parish for longer than anyone still living could remember, though the parish itself had shrunk to almost nothing. "We're looking for a family," Thomas said carefully. "Blackthorn." The old man's face changed at once. He crossed the chapel slowly, his cane tapping against stone, and stopped beneath a tall window on the eastern wall. Most of its glass had long since broken and been replaced with plain panes, but one section remained, a fragment of stained glass showing a shield divided in blue and silver, a hawk rising from a bed of thorns. "That crest," the vicar said, "was removed from the main window 40 years ago. This piece was all that survived the taking down. I kept it out of sentiment more than sense." Thomas stared at it a long moment, and Elena saw something pass across his face. Recognition, though he tried to mask it quickly. "You know this crest?" she asked. "I've seen it before," he said, too evenly. "In an old book, once." She let it lie, though she didn't believe him. The vicar led them to a small vestry room stacked with boxes of parish papers, most eaten through with damp. It took the better part of an afternoon, kneeling on the cold floor with candlelight guttering above them, before Elena's fingers found a bundle of papers tied with ribbon gone brittle as old leaves. "Blackthorn Manor," she read aloud, the name jumping out from a faded page. "Property of the Ravenshire line, held in trust following the death of the late owner, no direct heir surviving." Thomas went very still beside her. "Ravenshire," he repeated quietly. "Does that name mean something to you?" "It's a common enough name in these parts," he said, too quickly for it to sit easy with her. She kept reading. The manor, it seemed, had been quietly struck from the county's official records not long after the owner's death. Not sold, not seized, simply erased, as though someone had wanted the world to forget it existed at all. A final line, added in a different hand, caught her eye. Certain letters entrusted to Mrs. Agnes Coy, housekeeper of the estate, to be kept until claimed by rightful family. Do you know that name, Vicar? The old man shook his head slowly. Before my time, I'm afraid, but there's a village nearer the manor itself, Hartwell they call it, where old families have lived generations without moving on. If any Coy blood remains, you'd find it there. They thanked him and left as the light began to fail, the vicar walking them back down through the yews with his cane tapping a slow rhythm against the roots. At the bottom of the hill, half buried beneath a curtain of ivy nobody had cleared in years, Elena's boot struck something solid. She knelt and pulled the vines away to find an old stone milestone, its carved letters worn nearly smooth. Blackthorn. 6 miles, she read, tracing the shape with her fingers. Thomas crouched beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The stone felt like proof that the manor was no rumor, no story spun by old women at their gates, but a real place, waiting somewhere ahead in the dark, patient as it had been for decades. 6 miles, he said finally. We could be there by tomorrow evening. And then what? Then we find out what a family was willing to erase from every record in the county rather than let anyone remember it. Elena studied him in the fading light, the careful way he'd avoided her question about the crest, the name Ravenshire that had struck him like a blow he was trying not to show. Whatever secret Thomas carried, she was certain now it had nothing to do with a parson's schooling. They mounted their horses in silence and rode on as the last light drained from the hills, the milestone behind them pointing the way toward Blackthorn. And toward a truth Elena was beginning to suspect Thomas already half knew. They smelled the manor before they saw it. Damp stone and wild honeysuckle grown thick enough to choke a garden that had once, by the look of its bones, been carefully tended. The last mile of the journey had taken them off the road entirely, along a cart track swallowed by grass, through a stretch of forest where the trees grew close and old. When the manor finally came into view through a gap in the oaks, Elena pulled her horse up short. It was larger than she had imagined. A Georgian facade rose 3 stories against the darkening sky, its windows shuttered or broken, its once white stone gone gray with decades of rain. Ivy had claimed the eastern wing entirely, curling in through empty window frames as though the house were slowly being pulled back into the earth it stood on. "Nobody's lived here in a lifetime," Elena said quietly. "Longer than that, I think." Thomas dismounted and stood staring up at it with an expression she couldn't quite place, not the wonder of a stranger seeing something new, but something closer to a man returning to a place he'd only ever heard described. They tied the horses near the old stable block, its roof caved in on one side, and approached the front steps together. The door was unlocked, swollen with damp until it barely moved, and when they finally forced it open, the smell of dust and old wood rolled out to meet them. Inside, the manor was frozen in a moment decades old. Sheets had been thrown over most of the furniture, gray with dust, and a grand staircase curved up into darkness where the ceiling above had partly given way, letting in a thin gray shaft of evening light. Portraits still hung along the entrance hall, their subjects' faces cracked and faded, watching the two of them with painted eyes. "There's no caretaker," Elena said. "Surely someone was paid to look after all this?" "Perhaps once, not anymore." They lit candle stubs found in a kitchen drawer and began moving room to room as the light outside failed completely. In what had once been a library, shelves stood half-collapsed, books swollen with old damp and unreadable. In a drawing room, a harpsichord sat beneath its own sheet, one leg broken, as though someone had left mid-note and simply never returned. It was Elena who found the writing desk, tucked into a small study behind a door so warped it took both of them to force it open. The desk itself was modest compared to the grandeur of the rest of the house, a plain, practical piece,
its surface scattered with the dried husks of dead moths.
"Look at this,"
she said, running her hand along its edge until her fingers caught on a seam that shouldn't have been there. A small panel, cleverly fitted, gave way under pressure to reveal a shallow compartment behind it.
Inside lay a bundle of letters, their paper yellowed but dry, protected from decades of damp by the desk's close-fitted wood. Thomas crossed the room quickly and took them from her hands with a gentleness that surprised her. Not the eagerness of a treasure hunter, but something closer to reverence. He untied the ribbon binding them and unfolded the topmost letter, angling it toward the candlelight. His face changed as he read. Elena watched the color drain slowly from it, watched his jaw tighten and his eyes move faster down the page, then back to the top, as though he needed to read it twice to believe it.
"What is it?"
she asked.
"Thomas, what does it say?"
"They're addressed to my—" He stopped himself, and in the silence that followed, Elena understood that whatever careful lie he'd been telling since the storm had just cracked clean through.
"Your what?"
she pressed. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd pulled him in from the rain, there was no caution left in his face at all, only a kind of stunned, unguarded honesty. "My grandmother," he said. "These letters are addressed to my grandmother." Elena felt the floor of everything she thought she understood shift beneath her. A parson-taught traveler did not have a grandmother connected to a vanished manor and a family crest struck from a chapel window. She thought of the mark on his hand the night of the storm, the name Ravenshire he'd tried to wave away as common, the careful, trained way he sketched maps no ordinary man would bother sketching. "Who are you, really?" she asked quietly. Thomas didn't answer at once. He looked down at the letter in his hands, then out through the broken window toward the dark shape of the overgrown garden, as though the manor itself were waiting to hear what he'd say. "I think," he said slowly, "the answer to that is in these letters. And I think, Elena, that everything I believed about my own family may be about to come apart." Outside, the wind moved through the dead garden, and somewhere in the walls of the old house, something settled with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. The letters were older than either of them had expected. The ink faded to brown, the hand cramped and difficult in places where damp had crept into the folds. Thomas tried reading them aloud that first night at the manor, but half the words defeated him, and by midnight he admitted defeat and wrapped them carefully in a spare shirt for the journey ahead. "We need someone who can read legal hands," Elena said. "A solicitor or a clerk used to old documents." "Bakewell," Thomas said. "There's a market town not far south. My father once mentioned a firm there that had served this county for generations." He caught himself the moment the words left him, but Elena said nothing. There was little point pretending anymore. Whatever he was hiding, the manor had already begun pulling it loose, thread by thread, and she suspected he knew it as well as she did. They reached Bakewell by late afternoon 2 days later, the market square busy with stallholders packing away for the evening, the smell of wood smoke and roasting chestnuts drifting between the stone buildings. The solicitor's office sat above a draper's shop, reached by a narrow staircase that groaned under their weight. Mr. Aldous Price was a small, precise man with spectacles perched low on his nose and ink permanently staining 2 fingers of his right hand. When Thomas laid the letters before him, the old solicitor's expression sharpened with something close to recognition. "My grandfather kept the accounts for the Blackthorn estate," he said, turning the pages carefully, "before it went quiet. I've heard the name spoken of once or twice, always in a hushed sort of way, as though it were a shame better left buried." "Can you read them?" Elena asked. "Given time. Sit, both of you. This will take an evening, I think, and likely more." It took 3. Price worked through the letters with painstaking care, cross-referencing names against old ledgers his grandfather had left behind, deciphering handwriting worn thin by age and damp. Slowly, over candlelit evenings in his cramped office, a story began to take shape. one entirely different from the version Thomas had carried with him since childhood. Blackthorn Manor, it turned out, had never been stolen or lost through disgrace, as family whispers had always implied. It had been given. Thomas's great-grandfather, gravely ill in his middle years and given little hope of recovery, had been nursed back to health over the course of a hard winter by his younger sister, a woman the family records barely mentioned. In gratitude, and against the objections of his own wife, he had signed the manor over to her outright, not as an inheritance to be argued over later, but as a gift, freely given while he still lived to give it. She never married, Price said, tracing a line in an old ledger. Lived here alone with a small staff until her death. After that, the house should rightly have passed back to the main family line. Instead, it was struck from every record, Thomas finished quietly. It seems, Price said, that later generations believed the manor had been taken from the family through some manner of trickery, a misunderstanding, perhaps deliberately encouraged by someone who stood to gain from the shame of it. Once a family believes it has been wronged, Mr. Thomas, it rarely troubles itself to check whether the wrong ever truly happened. Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at nothing. Elena watched the weight of it settle over him. Not simply the loss of a house, but the loss of a story he had built his understanding of his own family around. My whole life, he said finally, I was told this was a wound, something taken from us unjustly. I grew up believing it, and I believe half my family still does. And instead, Elena said gently, it was an act of love nobody wanted to remember. Because remembering it would mean admitting we were wrong to be ashamed of it. She reached across the small table and touched his hand, careful and brief. You cannot judge people, Thomas, for believing what they were taught before they knew any better. You're only now learning the truth yourself, and look how it's shaken you. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his face again, the way it had been the night he'd first admitted the letters were addressed to his grandmother. You've a way of saying the thing I need to hear before I know I need it, he said quietly. Someone has to, she said, since you spend most of your time saying everything except the truth. It was gently said, but it landed all the same, and Thomas had the grace to look almost ashamed. Price, watching the exchange over his spectacles, cleared his throat and returned his attention to the ledgers, though Elena caught the faint, knowing set of his mouth. Whatever name Thomas had been avoiding, the old solicitor seemed to have already guessed at it. Outside, the market square had gone quiet for the evening, lanterns lit along the shop fronts, and somewhere beyond Bakewell's rooftops, the road toward Chatsworth waited. A road that would, within days, force Thomas to stop hiding altogether. The road toward Chatsworth wound through country far grander than anything they had passed before. Broad parklands behind iron gates, tenant farms neat and well kept, the occasional carriage rattling by with a crest painted on its door that Elena had never learned to read. She noticed Thomas grow quieter the closer they came, his shoulders set in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the night she'd first pulled him in from the storm. They stopped for the night at a coaching inn on the edge of the estate lands, a respectable establishment with a painted sign and a yard busy with grooms and departing carriages. It was grander than any inn they'd stayed in on the whole journey, and Elena felt suddenly conscious of her worn travelling dress among the finer company gathered in the taproom. We needn't stay here, she said quietly, as Thomas arranged for rooms at the desk. There'll be somewhere plainer further along. This will do, he said, and something in his voice told her not to press further. They had barely settled at a table near the fire when a man in a dark travelling coat entered the taproom, weather-worn and clearly ridden hard for days. He scanned the room, once, twice, and then his gaze landed on Thomas and stopped entirely. Elena watched the colour drain from the stranger's face, followed almost at once by open relief. Your Grace, the man said, crossing the room quickly and bowing low enough to draw the attention of half the taproom. Thank God, we have searched 3 counties for you. The household feared the worst. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Elena felt the taproom's attention shift toward their table. The innkeeper pausing mid-pour,
a pair of gentlemen by the window turning with open curiosity, a serving girl nearly dropping the tray in her hands. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing himself against something he'd known was coming and had simply run out of road to avoid.
"Hargreave," he said, low and tired, "you were not meant to find me yet."
"Forgive me, Your Grace, but the Duchess, your mother, has been beside herself. We had riders out from Ravenshire to the Scottish border." The steward's eyes flicked, briefly, curiously, to Elena, before returning to his master. "I came the moment word reached me you'd been seen on the Bakewell Road." The Duke of Ravenshire. Elena sat very still, the words arranging themselves slowly into something she could barely make sense of. The man who had knocked on her door in a storm, soaked and shivering, claiming a horse had bolted and a name that wasn't his own. This was one of the wealthiest, most powerful noblemen in England. She thought of every mile they had ridden together, every inn they had shared, every evening she had spoken to him plainly, as an equal, as though he were nothing more than a traveler with a mystery to solve. She thought, too, of how he had let her believe it.
"Elena." Thomas rose from the table, but she was already standing, her chair scraping back hard against the floorboards.
"I need air," she said, and walked out before he could say another word, past the staring faces in the taproom and out into the cold evening yard. She kept walking long after the inn's lights had faded behind her, out along the quiet country road, her thoughts moving faster than her feet. A duke. She had scolded him for not sitting properly. She had shared her father's memory with a man who could have bought her whole village without noticing the expense. Every kindness she'd offered along the road suddenly felt foolish, small, offered to a man who had never truly needed it. "Elena!" Thomas's voice came from behind her, breathless, as though he'd run the whole way from the inn. She didn't turn. "You let me believe you were nobody," she said. "A stranger with a horse that bolted. I never lied about who I was inside, only what I was called. That's a fine distinction for a man with a title." He came around to stand in front of her, and in the dim light she saw none of the ease he'd carried in the taproom, only something raw and uncertain, closer to the man who had first stood shivering at her door. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who see the title before they see me," he said. "Servants who agree with everything I say. Ladies who court my land, not my company. When I stood at your door that night, soaked and half frozen, you saw nothing but a stranger who needed shelter. You spoke to me the way you'd speak to anyone. I have not been spoken to plainly like that in years, Elena, and I did not want to lose it the moment you learned my name. You should have trusted me with the truth. I know that now." His voice softened further. "But every mile we've traveled, you have treated me not as a duke, but as a man. I would ask, if you'll allow it, that you continue to see me that way, because it is the only way I have ever wanted to be seen." Elena stood silent a long moment, the cold wind pulling at her shawl, the weight of everything she'd learned still settling uneasily in her chest. She thought of the letters waiting to be finished, the last part of a story neither of them yet understood. "One more stretch of road," she said finally, "but don't mistake my staying for forgiveness. Not yet." Thomas nodded, something like gratitude easing the tension from his shoulders, and together they walked back toward the lights of the inn, the truth finally standing plainly between them for the first time since the storm. They left the coaching inn 2 mornings later. The steward, Hargreaves, sent ahead to inform the household that his grace had been found, alive and well, and would return in due course. Thomas had insisted on finishing what they'd started first, and though Hargreaves' face had suggested he thought little of the delay, he had bowed and obeyed all the same. Elena rode beside Thomas now, rather than behind him, a small change neither of them mentioned aloud, but both seemed to feel. The easy warmth between them hadn't fully returned since the inn, but something steadier had taken its place. A wary, careful honesty that felt, to Elena, more real than the comfortable pretending that had come before it. The last of the letters, unfinished and water-stained at its edges, had mentioned a journal kept safe inside the family mausoleum attached to a parish church in Lincolnshire, far to the east of everything they'd travelled so far.
Price had traced the parish name through his ledgers before they left Bakewell, a small village called Fenholt, remote even by the standards of the county. The journey took the better part of a week. They passed through bustling market squares where farmers haggled over the last of the autumn harvest, through flat, windswept farmland that stretched to the horizon without a hill in sight, through riverside villages where barges moved slow and heavy along quiet water.
Elena had never traveled so far from the moors in her life, and she found herself watching the changing land with a kind of hunger she hadn't expected, a reminder of how small her world had been before the storm brought Thomas to her door. They talked more freely on this stretch of road than they had since Chatsworth. Thomas spoke, hesitantly at first, of a childhood spent being taught which fork to use before he was taught to read, of a mother who measured his worth by the alliances he might one day secure through marriage, of a title that had felt, for as long as he could remember, like a costume he'd been sewn into before he was old enough to object.
"I didn't run from home for adventure," he admitted one evening as they sat beside a fire in a modest riverside inn. "I ran because I needed one thing in my life that wasn't already decided for me before I woke up in the morning." "And did you find it?" "I found you," he said simply, and looked almost surprised at himself for saying it. Elena didn't answer that directly, though something in her chest loosened at the words. She only asked, quietly, what he meant to do once the search was finished. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I suppose that frightens me more than anything else on this whole journey." Fenholt, when they finally reached it, was smaller than any village they'd passed, a scattering of cottages around a squat Norman church, its churchyard crowded with leaning headstones gone soft with moss. The mausoleum stood apart from the rest, a low stone building near the churchyard's far wall, its iron gate rusted nearly shut. It took both of them, along with an iron bar borrowed from the sexton's shed, to force the gate open. Inside, the air was cold and close, the walls lined with stone shelves bearing the names of Ravenshires long dead. Dust lay thick over everything, undisturbed for what looked like generations. They searched for the better part of an hour before Elena found it, a small iron box tucked behind a loose stone at the base of the far wall, easy to miss unless one knew exactly where to look. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, lay a leather-bound journal. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he opened it. The handwriting inside matched the letters from Blackthorn's writing desk, the same careful, deliberate script, though the entries here were longer, more personal, written by a man clearly nearing the end of his life. He read aloud by the light of a single candle, his voice growing quieter with every page. The journal confirmed what Price's letters had already suggested, but went further still. Blackthorn Manor, the entries explained, had been deliberately kept separate from the main duchy, not through any accident of inheritance, but by design. It had been meant, from the moment it was gifted, to remain a place apart from wealth and title altogether, a refuge for tenant families whenever hardship struck the estate, a promise made quietly and kept even more quietly, generation after generation, until the family that had made it forgot why. "Let it never be counted among our holdings," Thomas read, his voice catching slightly. "For the moment it is counted, it will be valued for its land rather than its purpose, and its purpose is the only inheritance worth protecting." He closed the journal slowly, staring at nothing for a long moment. "All this time," he said, "my family believed the manor's disappearance was a wound, a theft, and it was never anything but a gift they were too proud, generations later, to understand." Elena laid a hand gently on his arm. "Then perhaps it's time someone understood it properly again." Thomas looked at her, something resolved settling into his face for the first time since the storm had brought them together. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe it is." Outside, the wind moved soft through the churchyard, and somewhere beyond Fenholt's quiet rooftops, the long road back toward Blackthorn Manor waited. No longer a search for something lost, but the beginning of something Thomas finally understood how to build. The manor looked different on their return,
though nothing about it had changed except the eyes seeing it. Where before Elena had seen only decay, ivy swallowing stone, windows gaping like wounds, she now saw the shape of what it had once been, and what it might become again. Thomas wasted no time. Within days of their return, word had gone out through the surrounding villages that Blackthorn Manor was to be restored, and that work would be paid fairly to any craftsman willing to take it on. Stonemasons arrived first, men who examined the crumbling east wing with the particular satisfaction of tradesmen given a problem worth solving. Carpenters followed, then glaziers to replace the broken windows, then a small army of labourers to clear the gardens back from the house before winter set in fully. Elena found her own place among them almost without deciding to. While Thomas oversaw the structural work, walking the grounds with the master mason and arguing gently over which stones could be saved and which needed replacing entirely, Elena gathered a handful of women from the nearest village to tackle the gardens and the old kitchen wing.
It wants a firm hand and patience, she told them, standing before a rose garden so overgrown it had nearly reclaimed itself into wilderness. Not unlike anything worth keeping.
The women laughed at that, and Eleanor found herself laughing too, surprised at how naturally the work suited her. Not the fine, delicate labor of a lady overseeing servants, but the honest, dirt-under-the-nails work she'd known her whole life, only now applied to something grander than a single cottage garden. Days folded into weeks. The manor slowly shed its silence. Hammers rang from the east wing each morning. Smoke rose properly from chimneys that hadn't drawn in decades. In the evenings, Thomas and Eleanor would walk the grounds together, watching the transformation take shape stone by stone, and something in those quiet walks had settled into an ease neither of them questioned aloud anymore. It was old Mrs. Pemberton, a widow from the nearest village, who arrived one afternoon offering to help in the kitchens, who first told Elena the story that changed how she understood the whole restoration.
"My grandmother worked in this house,"
the old woman said, kneading dough with hands gone soft and slow with age.
"Before it went quiet. She always said the mistress here, the one who was given the manor, you understand, never once turned away a tenant family in hard times, fed them from her own stores, found work for the men. My own grandmother's family owed their lives to this house one particularly hard winter."
Elena set down the bowl she'd been carrying, listening closely.
"She never spoke of it as charity,"
Mrs. Pemberton went on, "only as what was owed, family to family, neighbor to neighbor. When the house went quiet after her death, half the village mourned it like a death of its own. We simply never understood why nobody came to claim it again." By the time the story reached Thomas that evening, he sat silent for a long while by the drawing-room fire, the harpsichord now repaired and standing properly in its corner, the room around them warm and lit for the first time in decades. "Every family we speak to has a story like that one," he said finally. "A debt owed, a kindness given without asking for anything back. I've spent my whole life believing my family's wealth was measured in land and title. I never once considered it might have been measured, once, in exactly this."
"Perhaps that's why it disappeared," Elena said, "because somewhere along the way, your family stopped believing that kind of wealth was worth protecting."
Thomas looked at her across the firelight, and something in his expression had changed since the day they'd first found the manor's iron gate rusted shut. The uncertainty that had followed him since Chatsworth seemed to have settled into something steadier, more sure of itself. "You've done more for this house in a fortnight," he said, "than any steward I've employed in years." "I've only done what needed doing." "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the point I'm trying to make." Elena felt the warmth of the fire, the weight of his gaze, and something else besides. A feeling she'd been carefully avoiding naming since the coaching inn, when he'd asked her to see him as nothing more than a man. She had agreed then, out of caution, uncertain whether the request was even possible. Standing now in a restored drawing room, watching him watch her, she was no longer certain caution was the right word for what she felt at all.
Outside, the last light faded over gardens that were beginning, slowly, to bloom again, despite the coming winter. And somewhere in the walls of the old house, the quiet that had held for so long seemed finally, fully, to have broken. By early winter, Blackthorn Manor had become a house that no longer needed explaining to anyone who passed it on the road. The gardens Elena had coaxed back from wilderness now held their shape even under the first frosts, hedges trimmed, paths cleared, the old rose garden pruned and waiting patiently for spring. Smoke rose steadily from every chimney. Candlelight filled windows that had stood dark and broken for decades. Villagers who had once crossed themselves at the mention of Blackthorn now walked its drive freely, some to work, some simply to see with their own eyes that the old stories had finally come to an end. Thomas had spent the autumn months in careful, deliberate work of his own, not with stone and timber, but with lawyers and family records, formally restoring Blackthorn to its rightful place within the Ravenshire holdings. He did it, however, on his own terms.
The manor would remain separate in purpose from the rest of the duchy, exactly as his ancestor had intended, a refuge kept apart from wealth, rather than folded into it. He wrote to his mother, explaining as much, a letter Elena watched him draft 3 times before he was satisfied it said what he meant, without excusing what generations before him had misunderstood. The Duchess's reply, when it came, was shorter than either of them expected, and kinder.
"She says only that she wishes she'd known the truth sooner," Thomas said, reading it by the drawing-room fire, "and that she hopes I mean to keep it as it was intended, whatever the cost to the family's pride." "Do you?" "I've already begun." Word of the restored manor spread through the county faster than either of them had anticipated, and with it came the families themselves, tenants whose grandparents had once been fed through hard winters by a woman the county had nearly forgotten, come now to see whether the old promise still held. Thomas turned none of them away. By the time the first snow settled properly over the grounds, Blackthorn's kitchens were feeding more mouths than they had in a generation, its outbuildings sheltering families between harvests, its purpose restored as fully as its stone walls. Elena found she had never worked harder in her life, nor felt less like labor that needed to be forgiven for its dirt and its exhaustion. She oversaw the gardens, the kitchens, the small army of village women who had become, over the months, something closer to friends than employees. She had a place in the house that no one, least of all Thomas, ever tried to define with a title. It was on a clear, cold evening in December, the rose garden dusted with frost and glittering faintly under a rising moon, that Thomas found her there, alone, wrapped in a shawl not so different from the one she'd worn the night he first knocked at her cottage door. "I used to think," he said, coming to stand beside her, "that finding this house would be the end of the search. I understand now it was only the beginning of a much longer one." "And what is it you're searching for now?" "I think you already know." Elena turned to face him, the moonlight catching the same uncertain honesty she'd seen in him that first night by her hearth, before she'd known anything about dukes or duchies or manors erased from every record in the county. "You did more than help me find an old house, Elena," he said quietly. "You helped me understand what my family had forgotten how to value. I don't wish to ask you to leave the life you've known behind. I'm asking instead if you'll help me build what comes next. Here, beside me." She thought of the cottage she'd left behind on the moor, small and quiet and entirely her own, and of everything she'd found since, not a title, not wealth she'd never asked for, but a purpose that had somehow become hers as surely as it had become his. "I never needed a duke," she said. "I only ever needed a man worth trusting. I believe I found him." Thomas smiled, the careful weariness she'd first seen soaked through with rain, finally, fully gone from his face. Christmas came to Blackthorn Manor that year, for the first time in longer than anyone in the county could properly recall. The great hall, restored and warmly lit, filled with villagers and tenants, servants and neighbors, all seated together at long tables laden with food the kitchens had spent a week preparing.
Children who had never known the manor as anything but a ruin ran laughing between the tables, while old Mrs. Pemberton told stories of the mistress who had once done exactly the same, generations before. Elena stood at the edge of the hall for a moment, watching it all. The firelight, the laughter, the house that had nearly been forgotten, now full of exactly the life it had always been meant to hold. Thomas found her there and took her hand, and together they returned to the tables, to the noise and warmth of a house finally living up to the promise made long before either of them was born, that the truest inheritance a family could pass down was never land, nor title, nor the wealth carved into a coat of arms, but the simple, stubborn kindness that had brought a duke to a poor girl's door on a stormy night, and never once let either of them go.